And I think with the Center for the American Life, the idea behind it is very simple, which is why it wasn't so difficult to come up with. And it's this, that when you look around Washington, there's no, for the most part, I don't think that there is any real intellectual representation for the American people's desires, their desires for borders, their desires for an economy that works for them. But more importantly, I think that a lot have had this experience that the country that they grew up in is disappearing. And it wasn't their choice to make it disappear. And so our view is that the fight against the left's doctrines and the left's institutions, and I think that I think it's pretty easy to see that the left really does own the majority of America's national level institutions and has captured them while the right was essentially asleep, while they were advocating for GDP growth as the only standard by which to understand the health of a nation, while they were backtracking on every single moral issue, inch by inch, year after year. We found ourselves in this circumstance that all of these national institutions are captured, by which I mean the universities, K-12, the administrative state, the press, big tech, I mean, all of the ones that your listeners are very well aware of. And it seems astonishing that the right has not really tried even to be conservative. They've just moved so as to avoid a fight.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot going on there. I mean, yes, my listeners fully understand what you're talking about. We call it the blue church. Some people call it the cathedral. It is the universities, the media, the corporations, technology companies, all of our bureaucracies, all of the executive state, all of them on a national level have certainly been captured. And it happened over time, and it was sort of inch by inch. And people say, oh, it's just crazy kids on college, it'll just pass. And yeah, okay, well, those kids graduated and then they became entry-level folks in those institutions, which oddly, if I remember when I was growing up, when you went to go work at a corporation, you conformed to the corporate culture when you got there. But in universities today, we don't teach these, the critical folks don't teach people to go and conform. They teach them to go and to change. And so when they get into these institutions, they basically transform the institutions from the bottom up. And it took time, but they have fully captured everything. And it has created, and I'm talking to Christopher Caldwell in a couple of weeks as well, too. So I'm very excited about that, guys. It's created competing regimes within the United States. And I would like to begin setting the table here and talking about what is a regime in this sense? Because I think casual listeners hear the word regime and they're like, oh, that sounds terrible. Like it has some sort of negative connotation to it, but it really doesn't. Could you explain what a regime is, and then explain what the two regimes are in America, and let's begin to discuss how they're at odds?
Sure. Well, this word comes from Aristotle. He discusses it at length in the Politics, although it doesn't need Aristotle's authority. What it really means is the moral worldview of the ruling elite and the institutions that they control and use to impose that worldview. It's as simple as that. That's putting it in our terms. So we do live in, look, America is not a whole. It's divided up into parts that live ambiguously and uneasily together. And I think very broadly, in broad brushstrokes, one could say in the following way that there are two regimes that currently operate. On the one side is the regime of identity politics, whose moral vision, at least as it publicly states it, is that all of history is the history of the oppression of the marginalized, and that their liberation, it requires the demotion, the humiliation, and the taking away of power from the so-called oppressor class. And it identifies in its own literature, these are not my words, they say this all the time, as especially white people, but in particular white males. So it's a kind of, I don't like how conservatives call the left communists. I'm from Russia. I've seen what communism is. This isn't it. There's no abolition of private property. If anything, BLM really likes corporations. There's no sense that there should be a proletariat revolution whereby the proletariat are all unified, regardless really of sex, race, that should rebel against the capitalist elites. There's no such thing. This isn't what this doctrine is. And so that's the morality behind it. The other side, I think, again, in very broad brushstrokes, but it's just useful to paint broadly so as to be able to organize in your mind the first steps of getting into the phenomenon. The other side is what I think is appropriate to call the American way of life, which is constitutional government, but in particular, my interest is in the rule of law. That sounds like a very boring topic, but it's the essential framework of justice that legitimizes or delegitimizes a regime. Is there the equal protection of the laws for all citizens, regardless of what they are? Or is it what we have today, namely a kind of racial caste system? Or maybe it's not just racial, I should say. It's a caste system whereby the marginalized and their representatives are offered more rights, more protections, a greater voice. You've heard elevating voices. And the oppressor group, the so-called oppressor group, who has inherited his sins and who is tainted from the beginning to such a degree that he cannot help but be oppressive. They don't say, of course, that it's DNA. They don't really go there, but it's something of what they mean, that by virtue of being born what you are an oppressor that cannot see outside of your privilege. And when you've identified your adversary that way, the only thing that you can do is oppress that adversary and use all of the laws, all of the institutions, the public square to humiliate, delegitimize, and silence.
It's interesting that you say that they're not communists. True, but they definitely are Marxists, but in a new sort of a neo-Marxist framework, and applying the bourgeoisie and the proletariat model here is, as you said, to the oppressed and the oppressor. And I've written about this quite a bit in my book, Democrat to Deplorable. You can get that right now, please, if you'd like. In there, I describe how the Marxist model works with the oppressed and the oppressor, and given that the oppressor, by definition in their ideology, is the white male. What is the equivalent of private property rights in this equation? And I've come to believe that the equivalent here is masculine power. Right? It's masculine power that fuels masculinity, that fuels masculine power, which fuels the patriarchy, which fuels the oppression. Right? So all systems, all suffering of the oppressed class are due to the systems of the oppressor. The oppressor is the white male. The white male's power comes from masculine energy. And so masculinity is the private property rights in this framework. And so they have to obliterate masculine power and masculine energy. And one of the reasons I love talking to you guys from the Claremont is because I came up from a totally different perspective. I came up from the ground up, experiencing the dissonance, experiencing all of these phenomena we're discussing, just as like a dude trying to figure my way out in this world. And I've been pulling on the same string from sexual relationships and marriages, and what is it like to be a man in America in a radical feminist society. And I've been pulling on the same string for 10 years, and it's led me to this exact conversation right here, where we're putting things into a historical context and giving it a theoretical framework, and reflecting upon the literature of the folks that are calling us the oppressors. And it truly has narrowed down all the way that the private property rights in this scenario that need to be obliterated to release the freedom of the people, of the oppressed, is masculine power. And you know what? They've been pretty successful at that. They've been pretty successful at diminishing the masculine power. And I think that's something that you're interested in, isn't it? I think that you've drilled down onto that subject as well.
Yes, I'm very interested in it. And I agree to a great degree with you. I will say, I just want to add two very quick points. That while all of these institutions were being captured in order to impose these kinds of doctrines, you have to ask yourself, well, what exactly was the right doing? I mean, this has been coming for a long time. And here's one very quick answer. They were basically giving out corporate tax cuts for corporations on the view that if we have the oligarchs on our side, the party will always be okay. It'll be well funded. It'll be well represented. And we will produce, by representing them, by helping them, we will produce gratitude in them. In that kind of 30-year time period when it was, essentially the party of Mitt Romney or Mitt Romney types, they gave out corporate America, whatever corporate America wanted, roughly speaking. And in return, they went woke. So it's these kinds of massive failures that are shocking when you look at them in retrospect. Now, on this question of Marxism or not, look, it's fundamentally a religious point of view. And Marx does have a kind of pseudo-religious point of view, namely that there can be ultimate salvation and purification in this world. So it's all of the Christian categories of salvation and purification, but without God, the God of forgiveness or an afterlife. And what I mean is that in the Marxist world, it has to do with the purification from vile, as he would like to say, motives like greed. And so all of humanity will together blossom, regardless of color, country, etc. And in the identity politics world, it's in a way uglier because the world must be purified of the oppressor class, after which point there can be a full blossoming of all identities that have been hitherto taken away from them. Look, if we had a more intelligent, less dogmatic, ambitious intellectual class, you could just ask, they would ask basic questions of these kinds of doctrines. Like, for example, identity groups claim that their identities have been taken away from them. Well, then what are we celebrating right now? Because it would mean that their identity is really just structured by the oppressor group. These are just basic questions that nobody can ask, but that kind of blow the thing up. I would put it this way. If you just broadly take a 50, 60-year look at the transformation of African-American political thought in America, and you begin with MLK, who wanted integration, who believed in the Constitution, in the Declaration, and thought that on the basis of the mutual protection of all rights, there could be some emergence of a community. Fast forward to the very clear distinction between attempting to create Black identity, the Kente cloth, all of these outward attributes, which said that, no, we are separate. We are our own culture. We are separate. So step one failed, more or less, although I have hope that that can still be a model for us. Step two, the creation of identity, also kind of failed. And step three, which is the era that we're living in now, which is the true, we want our own identity, our own culture, but it must come with the obliteration, the humiliation of the dominant culture. And so ours must be celebrated and never judged, never judged. But all judgment, all energy, all hatred must be directed at the oppressor group's culture. It must be torn down to the point where you need an entire propaganda apparatus to shift all the images of society in advertising, in movies, in sitcoms, etc., so that the new heroes, as one writer that I often cite named Richard Delgado, who's a professor at the University of Alabama, who was a leader in critical race theory for many years, says we must shift all of the images of society so that the oppressors are looked at as, quote, brave and heroic, and so that the oppressor is looked at as disgusting and despicable. And to do that, you need to destroy all of the standards of American civilization, which they like to call white civilization, which is absurd. These are just Republican standards. I mean, there's nothing white about the rule of law. There's nothing white about families, whole families. These are calumnies.